Salve and welcome to this video lesson. We're looking at the grammar for Chapter 8, Capitulum Octavum. We looked at forms in the first part of the grammar lesson. Now we're going to be looking at some examples. Alright, so we're looking at quis and qui, and those mean who or which. Is ea id means this or that in the singular, or these or those in the plural. Is ea id also is close, but not exactly like he, she, it in English. So sometimes we translate them that way. Ille, la, lud means that, or in the plural, those. So we'll look at some examples of these. Alright, looking at the examples here in the book. Quis sacum portat, who carries the sack. Quis is a nominative. It's masculine or feminine, so we don't really know whether the person carries is going to be a guy or a girl. We're just asking, quis sacum portat. Then to answer that, you have to answer in a nominative. So notice servus sacum portat. The us ending is a nominative ending. That is the subject of the sentence. And then we get qui servus, which slave, okay? So qui there is actually an interrogative adjective, which looks exactly like the relative pronoun, okay, which we talked about the forms of in our previous lesson. So qui servus, which slave. I could also say something like quae ancilli, what slaves, or which slave women, rather. Alright, going on in our examples. Servus qui sacum portat est Cyrus. The slave who carries the sack is Cyrus. So the qui here is the relative pronoun, masculine, singular, nominative. And it refers back to the slave servus, right? Is, or ille servus sacum portat. That slave carries the sack. Okay, so is or ille, either one of those words there would mean this or that. Ille really should be translated as that, but is what we call a weak demonstrative, and so it can be translated either as this or that. It's not particularly pointing out as something close to us or far away, whereas ille points out something further away. Okay, so it has to mean that slave. And it could be further away in time or in place. Okay, Julius servum vocat. Julius calls a slave. Quem servum. So the question here has the accusative form. What slave? In other words, what slave does he call? Or I could also translate that, which slave? Servus quem Julius vocat. The slave whom Julius calls. Est Cyrus, is Cyrus. Julius eum, or illum, servum vocat. Now again here we could say Julius calls that slave. Whether it's an eum or an illum, either one of those could translate to that. Julius dominus servi est. Julius is the master of the slave. Cuius servi, whose slave? Or of whose slave? Rather to say of which slave. That would be a better way to do this. Sorry, this is the interrogative adjective, which is what we saw with qui servus and quem servum up above, but it's in the genitive case this time. So of which slave? He's the master of which slave? And then the answer is Cyrus est servus cuius dominus Julius est. Cyrus is the slave whose master is Julius. Julius dominus eius, or ilius servi est. Julius is the master of that slave. So again here, either eius or ilius, either one is fine. Both of those are genitive forms, agreeing with servi, of that slave. And if we used eius, we could also say of this slave again, but either one could be translated as of that slave. Julius servo malum dat. Julius gives an apple to the slave. Qui servo, to which slave? Alright, so again here we have the interrogative adjective. Qui is the same case, dative case. Same case as servo in the dative, singular. To which slave is the question? Servus qui Julius malum dat est Cyrus. The slave to whom Julius gives the apple is Cyrus. Julius ei or Ille servo malum dat. Julius gives an apple to that slave. So either one, ei or Ille, could mean to that slave. Note that it's dative, just like servo. It's agreeing with that. So it's called a demonstrative adjective. And do note again that ei could also be translated as to this slave. Ei servo. Sacus a servo portator. The sack is carried by the slave. A quo servo, by which slave? Servus a quo sacus portator est syrus. Slave by whom the sack is carried is Cyrus. Sacus ab eo or illo servo portator. The sack is carried, portator, passive verb, by that slave. Again, eo or illo, both of those are ablative, agreeing with servo. Both can mean that. The eo could also be translated this. Servi, sacos portant, the slaves carry sacks. Qui servi, what slaves? Servi qui sacos portant sunt Cyrus et Leander. The slaves who carry the sacks are Cyrus and Leander. Ii or Ille servi sacos portant. Those slaves carry the sacks. So whether it's ii or ei, you could also say, or the Ille, both of those will be translated those. Ii could also be these. Julius servos vocat, Julius calls the slaves. Quos servos, which slaves? In other words, which slaves does he call? It's accusative plural, right, of the interrogative adjective, quos. Servi quos Julius vocat, the slaves which, or whom, Julius calls, sunt Cyrus et Leander, are Cyrus and Leander. Julius eos, or illos, servos vocat. Julius calls those slaves. And again, the eos could also be translated these, if you wanted to say these slaves. Notice eos and illos both agree with servos. Again, these are the demonstrative adjectives. Julius dominus servorum est. Julius is the master of the slaves. Quorum servorum, of which slaves? Servi quorum dominus est Julius sunt Cyrus et Leander. The slaves whose master Julius is are Cyrus and Leander. Julius dominus eorum or illorum servorum est. Julius is the master of those slaves. Eorum, illorum both agree with servorum, the demonstrative adjectives. Julius servis mala dat. Julius gives apples to the slaves. Quibus servis, to which slaves? Servi quibus Julius mala dat sunt Cyrus et Leander. Slaves to whom Julius gives apples are Cyrus and Leander. Iis or illis servis mala dat. To those slaves he gives apples. Saci a servis portantur. The sacks are carried by the slaves. A quibus servis, by which slaves? Servi a quibus saci portantur. The slaves by whom the sacks are carried, sunt Cyrus et Leander, are Cyrus and Leander. Ab iis or illis servis saci portantur. By those slaves the sacks are carried. All right, so that concludes all the masculine examples. The feminine and the neuter examples are really just playing through the same kind of possibilities, just using feminine and neuter forms, right? So it doesn't really change much. You'll see some spelling changes to deal with the feminine forms or the neuter forms, but the basic idea of how to use them is the same. So I don't think we need to go through all of those. Well, I hope that made sense, and we'll try to take a look then at the hic haec hoc forms in one last lesson. All right. Valete.